Hello again, 102. To conclude Chapter 19, we're just going to go over a few more items of American foreign policy in the aftermath of the War of 1898 and the legacy of Theodore Roosevelt. William Howard Taft was his hand-picked successor. More on that in coming chapters. And by the end of Taft's term in 1912, TR is very dissatisfied with what Taft did. But in foreign policy, he continued many of Roosevelt's ideas, including the idea of dollar diplomacy, where investments in less developed nations will then be protected, if need be, by American military force. And he used the State Department to help American companies and banks invest in foreign countries, especially in East Asia and the less developed nations of Latin America and the Caribbean. And to ensure the stability of those investments, Taft, like Roosevelt, did not hesitate to intervene using the military if there's any sort of political or economic problems. And we saw the map of the Caribbean and the numerous times that the Norteamericanos stepped in to the Caribbean region. Eventually, the first Democratic Southerner to occupy the White House since Franklin Pierce in 1856. Wilson was from Virginia. More on his background. He was the president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey. We'll be talking about Mr. Wilson a great deal in the coming chapters. Originally, when he runs in the election of 1912, another watershed election, as was 1896, he will attack dollar diplomacy. And originally, when he was elected, he promised to treat Latin Americans on terms of equality and honor. But Wilson is going to end up intervening way more than Theodore Roosevelt or William Howard Taft ever did. And you can see here how many times he went into these different countries, sending American troops in for various reasons. In the Dominican, after they refused to sign a treaty that would have given the United States a, quote, special role, unquote, in governing the island nation, he sent in the Marines, and they established a military government, and they fought a guerrilla war against anti-American rebels. Mexico, however, is a much more difficult problem. There is a revolution in 1910 against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. He had given foreign corporations free rein in developing the nation's economy. As we'll see later on, this is also going to be the legacy of Cuba. After the Batista family comes in, they will govern Cuba much like Mexico was governed in the aftermath of their 19th century independence. Eventually, it devolves into dictatorship. And the dictators then will be out to make profits for themselves and not to be concerned with the welfare of the citizens that they govern. Revolutionary armies occupied Mexico City in 1911, and the victorious rebels then began squabbling amongst themselves. The leader of the rebellion, Francisco Madero, was himself overthrown by his chief of staff, General Victoriano Huerta, who assumes power, and then he kills Madero, and Wilson refuses to recognize a government of butchers. It was vital, he insisted, for Latin American nations to have, quote, fairly decent rulers, unquote. Huerta ignores Wilson, and he establishes yet another dictatorship, and Wilson decided that Huerta must be removed. And they sent troops into Veracruz, which is on the Mexican coast, and this backfires. Wilson thought that his good intentions would be good enough. We're doing this for the benefit of the Mexican people, not for any aims in terms of trying to annex Mexico or anything along those lines. The Mexican people do not interpret American troops being on their soil as being anything but bad news. They view them as invaders. Newspapers in Mexico shout for vengeance, vengeance, vengeance. And for 7 months, the Americans governed Veracruz. They will finally leave in late 1914 after Huerta is overthrown by Venustiano Carranza. And then the final problem will go on with the infamous Pancho Villa, the outlaw. In 1916, he is going to launch raids into Texas and New Mexico in order to promote himself and portray himself as being anti-American. A good tactic to try and gain support from other Mexicans in his political aspirations. He wanted to run Mexico. And in March of 1916, they actually invaded and attacked Columbus, New Mexico, just 3 miles across the border, with Villa shouting, "Kilo de gringos!" His army of 500 peasant revolutionaries looted stores, they burned the town, and they killed 17 Americans, men and women. And this outraged many Americans. As a result, a furious Woodrow Wilson sent General John J. Pershing to Mexico with a force of 6,000 soldiers with the aim of capturing Villa and destroying his army. And they chased him for a year. And they chased them all over the mountains of northern Mexico. And Pershing muttered, "It's like trying to chase a rat in a cornfield." They never caught Villa. And in 1917, the troops were ordered home. And Villa he named his mule President Wilson. But by the early months of 1917, a much greater conflict breaks out. Actually, the conflict had broken out in Europe in 1914. We stayed out of it for a while, but by early 1917, there is no longer any escaping the European conflict of World War I.